March 16, 1999. It's Tuesday in Franklin Township, New Jersey, a bedroom community about 40 miles southwest of Manhattan.
The Franklin Township area is basically a suburb of New York City.
We have direct train access to New York, but a quiet town, nothing like the big city at all.
It's a great place to raise your children. You don't have so much of the hustle and the bustle.
There wasn't as much of the crime that you find in the city.
But is any place entirely safe? At 9 o'clock that morning, one Franklin resident makes a worried call to the local police.
The caller wanted to file a missing persons report for her granddaughter, 18-year-old Sakira Stokes.
When was the last time you seen your granddaughter, ma'am?
Yesterday afternoon, she left here around 5 o'clock.
She told police that Sakira had told her that she would be home by 10.
But when her grandmother went to bed a little after 11, Sakira still hadn't come home.
Her grandmother thought, well, maybe she's just hanging out a little later than usual.
She's 18 years old, so her grandparents are giving her some leeway. So not coming home by 10 o'clock at night, it's not a big deal.
But when her grandmother awoke in the next morning and realized that Shakira was not there, that really gave her a reason to be worried.
She wasn't here this morning when I got up, and when I checked, her bed was still made.
The fact that she did not come home and she hadn't called, it was out of character for her.
Sakira would usually contact her grandma to let her know what was going on. She was really concerned.
Sakira's grandmother had attempted to track the teenager down herself, but it wasn't easy.
This was 1999, back when most people did not have cell phones.
They started reaching out to people that they thought that she might have been with.
Mostly, they were just leaving messages on people's answering machines.
Unable to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, Sakira's grandmother decided to call the police.
Her family was very upset by this point.
They couldn't find her. She essentially disappeared.
Where could she be?
Sakira Stokes grew up in a loving home with her grandparents.
It's a special relationship. She had a close relationship with them. It's not like it's your mom and dad, but it's Pop or Yaya. They had little tidbits of wisdom you would never get from anyone else.
They raised her and instilled great values in her.
A confident young woman, Sakira never cared what others thought.
Sakira was mature. She was already focused, knew what she wanted.
She had a very, very forthcoming personality.
And from a young age, she knew what she wanted to be.
Hey, wanna go work on the car?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's go.
She wanted to be a mechanic.
Her grandfather was a really good mechanic, and even from a young age, she was by his side, learning how to fix things.
She was good with her hands.
After graduating high school in 1998, she'd set out to achieve her goal.
She found a job at a local auto shop, and she was planning on going to technical school.
But cars weren't her only passion. Whether working on a vehicle or riding in one, Sakira almost always had the stereo going.
She found music as this kind of outlet.
For a lot of young people, music is a way of self-expression. Especially when you're riding in your car, you put down your windows, you blast your music.
So even with the love that she had for fixing things, she developed a love for music. Music is in the fiber of the community, so there were always little clubs that you could go to.
And after one show, Sakira met a man who could change her life forever. 21-year-old Dane Ellis.
Dane was a rapper that was up and coming.
His stage name was Drama.
She fell in love with the way he performed.
You killed it up there.
Oh, you think so?
Absolutely.
She had seen Drama on stage that she said in her mind, I'm going to get him. He saw the spark in her eye.
He was very, charming, handsome.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Soon the young couple was officially an item.
Shakira's 18 years old, so this is love-struck, young love. Everything is good.
She even introduced him to her grandparents.
This is Dane.
Dane comes from a loving family. He worked with his dad and his family's business. He was very mannerable, very likable.
They accepted the fact that he was a few years older than her, and they say, let's give this guy a chance because he seems to come from a good foundation.
Shakira provided Dane with the same sort of foundation.
This young woman becomes his, number one cheerleader.
She wanted the best for him. She wanted him to take his rapping to another level.
She's helped him find his way, helped him find his voice.
And toward the end of 1998, Shakira helped Dane take the next big step.
She took Dane down to Virginia to meet some of her family members who were also involved in music.
He went in the studio, he did his thing, he came out with a contract. He was able to score a record deal.
From that point on, it appeared that drama was on the road to stardom.
She thought, he's going to make it big and I'm going to be right beside him. We're going to do this together.
Instead, just months after Dane signed his record deal, Shakira has disappeared.
Her family realized that she did not return home from going out the evening before, which was very alarming.
Shakira usually will contact her grandma or let her grandma know what's going on.
But now, after failed attempts to find her on their own, Shakira's grandparents have contacted the police.
I don't know where she could be.
Police take the report, but also try to reassure Shakira's worried grandmother.
You think she went into the city?
You could actually board the train, and within 30 to 40 minutes, you're in Manhattan.
Shakira's grandmother doesn't think so.
She said Shakira really didn't go into the city very much, and when she did, she always made sure to say something beforehand.
She had proven to be relatively responsible, and so there was no reason to think that she would lie about her plans.
But could there be another explanation for her disappearance?
Is there a boyfriend? Somebody she stayed overnight with?
She is seeing someone.
Shakira's grandmother was not entirely sure that this was still the case.
The relationship was not as solid as it had been.
She was talking about breaking up with Dane.
Hey, Dane. We need to talk.
With the loving support of his girlfriend Shakira Stokes, aspiring rapper Dane Ellis was on the verge of greatness.
She saw something in him. She felt as though he was gifted.
He's getting ready to drop his first album, and she was right there by his side.
But now, Shakira's family is desperate to find her.
Shakira did not come home the night before, and no one had heard from her since.
It wasn't like her for her to just disappear and not, say anything.
After reporting her missing, police asked Shakira's grandparents to come down to the station to meet with detectives.
It's very crucial that everybody hits the ground in the beginning and try to document everything that they can.
Detectives are especially interested in something Shakira's grandmother mentioned in her phone call.
She said that her granddaughter was thinking about breaking up with her boyfriend, Dane.
And your granddaughter told you this?
Not exactly. I heard it from her friend Felicia.
Her grandmother says Felicia was who Shakira had gone to see when she left the previous afternoon.
And you sure she went to Felicia's?
Yes, Felicia was the first person I called this morning when Shakira didn't come home.
Felicia told her that Shakira had specifically come over to talk about her troubles with Dane.
Did Felicia tell you why Shakira wanted to break up with him?
She didn't get into details.
Hoping Shakira's friend can tell them more, detectives immediately ask her to come in for an interview.
Felicia did confirm to the detectives that Shakira came to her house that afternoon.
So, what'd you guys talk about?
Mostly Dane.
They had a discussion about how she was feeling and that things just was not panning out with Dane.
Felicia tells detectives that things between Sakira and Dane had changed after he signed his record deal.
Even though she and Dane started off with this very, very loving relationship, she really felt as though Dane was kind of putting her on the back burner.
She said he made a couple trips down to Virginia alone. Said they needed him to cut some new vocals.
There were trips into New York City, supposedly to meet with producers and other industry people.
According to Felicia, Sakira didn't have a problem with that.
Being the type of person that she was, she did not mind being very supportive of her mate.
But it turned out that Dane wasn't spending all that time on his career.
What she found out is that he had somebody in different area codes.
When she was supporting Dane and was there for him, he was dealing with multiple women, and that really hurt her.
Felicia says that when Sakira confronted Dane about his infidelity, he shrugged the whole thing off.
The only explanation he has is, this is a part of the life. This is who I am. This is what you signed up for. You knew I was forever.
He even said, do you think you're the only person that came to see me after I was on stage? Get a life. There was plenty of women after me.
He was feeling like he can have his cake and eat it too, and that wasn't what Sakira wanted.
According to Felicia, Sakira hadn't broken things off immediately.
She was a bit conflicted about what she should do.
But Felicia says that Sakira had eventually decided that Dane's new lifestyle just wasn't for her.
She began to realize the Dane she fell in love with was transitioning into drama. Not just drama for a name, but drama in life. And she just didn't want to deal with it anymore.
She was like, I'm not going to be one of these other chicks.
She made a conscious decision that I'm not going to be involved in that whole type of situation.
Sakira told Felicia that she was ready to break things off with Dane.
According to Felicia, Sakira had decided to do it that night, face to face.
She felt as though she owed it to him to go and meet with him in person to finally break everything off.
When she left your house, she went to see Dane?
That's what she said.
Thank you for your time.
After hearing Felicia's story, detectives asked Dane Ellis to come in for an interview.
When Dane Ellis is brought in for questioning, he says, Felicia's right, she did stop by.
He says that Sakira picked him up at his parents' house, and they drove to a nearby shopping center.
According to Dane, they had smoked marijuana and was hanging out in the car.
So is that all you did?
Well, no.
Dane, we need to talk.
Yeah, you probably should.
He did admit that they were breaking up, and the way he came across was like it wasn't a big deal.
Things are changing for him. He was getting ready to go on the road with his new album.
Dane felt like he was about to be on top of the world, and he didn't want to be weighed down by anyone.
So you're what, just okay with it? To be honest, I was relieved.
He said he actually was going to break up with her.
It was like, ooh, good, that weight is off of me, because now I don't have to do it, she did it.
He said that they parted on such good terms that Sakira had even driven him home.
What time did she drop you off?
About 9:30.
Anybody else see you come home?
My parents.
Although according to Dane, he wasn't home for long.
He says that after she left, I called his other honey.
According to Dane, he didn't just call her.
What he says is, I spent the night with her.
Sakira Stokes' ex-boyfriend Dane Ellis has just told detectives he had nothing to do with the 18-year-old's disappearance.
He told detectives that he wasn't upset about their recent breakup. In fact, Dane said that he'd been planning to end the relationship as well.
He says it was no big deal. I'm about to go on tour and my life's about to change and I don't need to be weighed down to anybody.
In fact, Dane says he was so unbothered that he spent the rest of the night with another woman, 22-year-old Aubrey McQueen.
Aubrey was one of the women that Dane had been hooking up with behind Sakira's back.
He said that he called her to come pick him up, and they went to the motel together.
Why a motel?
Are you serious?
He said, well, he lived at home with his parents. He couldn't take girls there, so he would often have hookups at the hotel.
When detectives follow up with Dane's parents, the first part of his story appears to check out.
The parents did confirm that Dane came home that night at around 9:30.
He comes home, he tells his parents, yeah, Sakira just dropped me off, but I'm gonna run back out.
Dane left out again around 10 p.m. and they didn't see him again until the next day, which coincides with what Dane had told the detectives.
Detectives also contact Aubrey, the woman Dane says he'd spent the night with at a motel in the nearby town of North Brunswick.
She confirmed that she picked Dane up from his parents' home around 10 o'clock and they went and checked into the hotel.
When detectives ask her if he seemed upset or angry, she says no.
They asked did he talk about his breakup, and she said, we didn't do a lot of talking.
It was mostly like a physical interaction. They spent the night, having sex.
Hotel staff also confirm that Dane and Aubrey stayed the night.
The front desk at the hotel confirmed that Dane had checked in a little after 10 p.m. and that he checked out the next day.
Dane had a pretty solid alibi. Everyone saw him at the motel. He was physically there with Aubrey. He checked in at the time he said, and he checked out.
It looks as though Dane is telling the truth about what happened, and that, as he said, the breakup really didn't bother him.
But in that case, where is Sakira?
She didn't have a cell phone, so there really wasn't any way to track her.
They put out a bolo on her car, but at this point, they didn't have much else to go on.
Detectives are really working with what they had.
And they don't have any evidence that anything has actually happened to Sakira.
We've heard nothing. We've seen nothing.
She just broke up with her boyfriend. Maybe she needed some time alone.
As for Sakira's family, they're certain something terrible has happened to her.
Her family could not understand why she had not reached out to anyone.
Sakira hadn't shown up at work either.
So they knew at this point something had to be wrong.
And so you panic about the only thing that makes sense.
They wonder if someone abducted her. That's very possible. She's a young 18-year-old girl.
It's a very emotional time. You want to have this hope that you'll find her, but the reality is the family was scared, afraid of the possible reality that she may have been gone.
By Wednesday morning, 36 hours after Sakira went missing, the family launches their own search effort.
They didn't hear any updated information, so they take matters into their own hands.
But getting the word out about Sakira's disappearance is a difficult task.
This is back at the end of the 90s. We didn't have social media where we could just make a post and it would go viral.
Without social media, the outreach is in supermarkets, the outreach is at the clinic, the outreach is the pastor giving the mother 5 minutes at church to talk to the people and pass stuff out.
They're really on the ground trying to do everything to find Sakira.
Homicide.
And as more people become aware that Sakira is missing, one of her friends calls in with a possible lead.
She was having beef with another girl named Lola.
Lola was another one of Dane's side chicks.
Dane had many women in his life, but Lola felt like she was really his #1 girl.
Yo, Dane's mine, you understand that?
And she felt that Sakira was standing in her way.
I promise you this will be the only time I'm warning you.
According to a friend of Secura Stokes, the missing teen had a contentious relationship over her boyfriend, Dane Ellis, with a woman named Lola Barrett.
Lola was another of Dane's side chicks, although she didn't see herself that way.
She was very possessive, and she felt like Dane belonged to her.
Which, according to Secura's friend, had led to friction between Lola and Secura.
She told the detectives how Lola felt in her mind that she was Dane's woman and that Secura was an intruder.
And so for Lola, Secura starts to be this nemesis, the one, unlike these other side chicks, was getting favor with my man. You too close.
And according to Secura's friend, Lola felt so threatened by Secura that she'd made her claim to Dane crystal clear.
Lola actually went and confronted Secura face to face.
She was really kind of off the chain, as they say in the street.
Yo, Dane's mine. You understand that? What?
She had no problem telling her, stay away from my man.
Your man. Yes, my man. So
How she presented was as if she would do anything and stop anyone from getting in her way.
This young woman is like, I'm getting rid of all the competition. I'm all the way in.
The question for detectives is, how far would Lola go to get rid of her competition?
It really appeared that there was a rivalry between these two women, and that Lola was the aggressor, and Secura's now missing.
When detectives bring Lola in for questioning, she doesn't deny having words with Secura.
Yeah, so?
Well, she's missing.
Okay, well, I don't know nothing about that, so.
She kind of dismissed the whole thing. Well, I don't know anything about her disappearing. I don't really care. You know, that type of attitude.
She said, I don't pay her any mind. She doesn't concern me.
It's a claim detectives find hard to swallow.
If you don't pay this girl no mind, why'd you threaten her?
That was before I found out what Dane was really up to.
Lola basically says, you know, Dane dates everyone. Secura wasn't as important. She was just another one of us.
Oftentimes when men are dating multiple women, it causes a lot of confusion. The man can be very manipulative and telling one woman something and another woman something else, and tension could fly.
The dude cheats and the two women fight. He's sitting there going, look, women are fighting over me.
So you had nothing to do with Secura's disappearance?
Over Dane? He isn't worth it.
The way Lola told it, Secura wasn't the only one who was beginning to realize how much she had been played by Dane.
He was dating multiple women. He was lying to multiple women. And essentially every woman that Dane was with believed that they were his main woman, when in fact they weren't.
Still, they do ask Lola where she was on the evening Secura disappeared.
She reports that she was in Newark, New Jersey visiting her family, which is about an hour away.
You free to go.
When the detectives followed up, her alibi checked out.
Lola was actually in Newark the day Secura went missing.
She was actually telling the truth.
With that, 72 hours after Secura's disappearance, the trail goes cold.
There's no more leads on where Secura may be.
No one had come forward with more information, and they had run out of potential suspects.
And solving a crime in 1999 was a lot harder than it is today.
Back in 1999, there was really no technology out there to even find people. There was no cameras on light poles and tracking devices seeing where cars were located.
There was no, let's check her Facebook, let's check her Instagram, let's see what the last thing she posted on TikTok. And it can't do anything with nothing.
Weeks turn into months with no new progress.
Her family is still holding on to hope, still trying to find Secura. But the reality is, detectives have to move on.
Because of manpower and time, they could not continue on a case where they were not getting any more leads and no new developments were coming along. They didn't totally give up on it, but they just kind of had to put it to the side.
Maybe simply she just didn't want to be found.
There was still no proof of any crime.
Until on May 16th, 2 months after Sakira's disappearance, there's a surprising new development.
Sakira's cousin is visiting a friend in a apartment complex a few towns over.
He just happened to see a car that reminded him of Sakira's car.
He called their grandmother to ask what Sakira's license plate number was.
It's like maybe this will lead to where she is.
It is? Okay.
Two months after Sakira Stokes disappeared, a relative has made a possible breakthrough in finding the missing teen.
A family member spotted what he thought was Sakira's car parked right outside an apartment complex in a nearby town.
He quickly called her grandmother and asked for the plate number.
The plates matched. It was Sakira's car.
It's like maybe this will lead to where she is.
When detectives respond, that turns out to be true. Just not in the way the family hoped.
When they open the trunk, they find the body of a female that was barely decomposed.
While too badly decomposed for immediate identification, detectives assume that the body is Sakira's.
She went missing in March and it is now May. We have to consider that Sakira's body has been in this trunk for possibly 2 months.
With the weather changing to springtime, the heat had begun to really decompose her body.
But one thing is clear.
Her underwear and her pants are gone.
Now they're wondering, was there sexual assault?
Was she abducted off the street?
As for how Sakira's car ended up there, detectives have little to go on.
There were no surveillance cameras at the complex to give any clues as to what might have happened.
A canvass of the neighbors also fails to turn up any useful information.
Different residents say that they remember seeing the car for several weeks, but they're not sure exactly when it came. There was nothing suspicious about it, so they didn't think anything.
When you're in a large apartment complex like that, you got a lot of cars. Some people don't use their car all the time. They might be taking mass transit to get to work, and they might just use their car on the weekend. So it wasn't like it stuck out.
When detectives receive the results of the autopsy, they confirm that the body is Sakira's.
The only way they could identify her is the dental records.
The family is just torn between relief that they found her, but devastation that she's no longer with them.
The unknown, oh my God, where is she? What could be happening to her is gone. Immediately replaced by the, oh my God, what happened to her?
The autopsy does provide some answers.
Sakira died from one single gunshot wound to the head.
Despite her missing clothing, there were no signs of sexual assault.
Detectives begin to think that there perhaps was someone trying to mask the appearance of what has actually happened by making it seem she was assaulted and robbed.
So take her pants off, then it's gonna look like somebody did something sexual.
But who was trying to throw detectives off their trail? As news of Sakira's murder spreads, a young woman comes forward with information that could break the case.
She came forward because this case was all over the news. She said, listen, I had a brief relationship with Dane.
I used to go out with Dane before he met Sakira.
The woman's name is Monique Davies.
According to Monique, he was very abusive to her mentally and physically. He would beat her.
But Monique says that isn't the most important thing she has to tell them about Dane.
Dane, at one point, had actually put a gun to her head.
When I saw that her body had been found and that she had been shot, I knew I had to say something.
Could the same thing have happened to Sakira?
The fact that Dane previously threatened her with a gun, this causes the detectives to say maybe they need to take another look at Dane.
Dane was not a street guy. He didn't have any prior history of being involved with weapons. But we're getting a statement from a young lady that he, in fact, has had a gun in his possession. He, in fact, has threatened me with the gun.
But does that mean Dane killed Sakira?
We don't know if there was any abuse that was shown before this between the two of them.
However, it had been established that Dane had a pattern of violent and abusive behavior towards women.
The detectives also knew that Sakira wanted to break up with Dane.
Statistics tell us that that is the most dangerous time for someone in a domestic violence relationship.
And while Dane's alibi for the night of the murder mostly checked out, there was one potential hole in his story.
Dane only told his parents that Sakira dropped him off that night.
Dane's parents said that they did not see her that night. There's a possibility that he may have done this.
When detectives ask Dane to come in for a second interview, he readily agrees.
Thank you for meeting with us.
Sure. Anything I can do to help.
Dane seems upset by the news that Sakira's been found dead. However, he claims he has little additional information to give them.
Dane continues to stick to his story that he didn't know what happened.
You guys just talked, and then she dropped you off at home?
Yeah.
Dane was adamant that what he told them was correct.
Detectives don't buy it.
I'm gonna tell you what I think happened. I think you got mad she was breaking up with you, and you shot.
No way.
Yeah? Are you sure about that, Dane?
The detectives said, well, you put a gun to Monique. How do we know you didn't put a gun to Sakira's head?
Monique?
Yeah, Dane. We know all about that.
Dane looked in disbelief. How did they know about Monique?
Just like that, Dane's story changed.
No. You guys got her all wrong. That's not what happened.
He said Sakira was shot by accident.
"21-year-old rapper Dane Ellis has just admitted to Franklin Township detectives that he shot and killed his ex-girlfriend, Sakira Stokes. But he claims it was an accident.
He insisted that the breakup had gone smoothly, just like he told them originally.
We were hanging out. Smoked a little.
Everything was cool.
Yeah. Till I asked for my gun back.
What gun?
He said, I had given her a gun to protect herself when I was going back and forth to Virginia.
She told him that it was in the glove compartment, and when he reached for it, Dane claims that she wanted to see it.
Oh, wait, can I see it first?
No, what for?
I just want to show you something.
He said, no, this is nothing to play with.
He said she grabbed for it and he pulled back.
They got into a tussle over the gun and that it accidentally went off.
Oh my God.
Dane says that once he realized Sakira was dead, he panicked.
He didn't think that anyone would believe that it was an accident. So he put Sakira's body in the trunk of the car.
Then he walked home, called Aubrey, and spent the night with her.
He said he went back the next day and took the car to that apartment complex and left it there.
Detectives have serious doubts about Dane's story.
If that was the case and it was an accident, why did you meet up with that woman at the hotel and have sex that night? Why did you not communicate with her grandma about what happened? Why did you pretend like everything was okay and that you didn't know where she was? Even after, detectives were looking for her and the family was searching for her.
To detectives, the reason is clear. This was no accident.
What he did was calculated.
She was stuffed in the trunk. And Dane went and slept with another woman and showed no remorse for just seeing someone he cared about die right in front of him.
He not only tried to cover his tracks, he went out and celebrated.
At the end of the interview, detectives placed Dane under arrest for murder. And when his trial begins on January 25th, 2001, Dane's story about the supposedly accidental shooting isn't all the prosecutors have against him.
2 other young females came forward and said that Dane had also pointed a gun at their foreheads.
That was in addition to Monique Davies, the woman who first came forward.
According to the prosecution, they were the lucky ones.
Prosecutors believe that when Sakira broke up with Dane, he was enraged at the fact that this young woman would break up with him.
He's the man now. I got a record deal. I'm going on the road. I got women dropping at my feet. What are you talking about? You don't want to be with me anymore. He felt like he was disrespectful.
His ego got the best of him.
I don't think she would have thought that anything like this was going to happen.
He was a good, clean-cut young man. But once he became involved heavily into the music scene, he transitioned into this persona of being this hardcore rapper, Drama.
Sometimes people try to take on that persona and it consumes them.
When it's the defense's turn, they argue that Dane is still the clean-cut young man that Sakira first knew.
Defense continued to argue that Dane did not murder Sakira.
The defense really wants to stick to the story that Sakira possibly reached for the gun went off, and she was accidentally shot.
But will the jury believe it?
The jury, after hearing all of the evidence, found Dane guilty.
Dane was sentenced to life plus 5 years.
But he'll be eligible for parole in 2033, after serving only 32 of those years.
I hope that Sakira's family is able to find peace, and the fact that Dane has been brought to justice will be enough for them to be able to sleep at night and to know that, the truth has come out.
It's a truth Sakira's family hopes will serve as a warning to others.
It's very important to pay attention to red flags in relationships.
You feel as though you're in a situation that you can't get out. Talk to a family member, talk to a friend, tell someone that you're really close to and they can do what they need to do to get you out of the situation.
The biggest thing is safety and using all of your resources, including the authorities. Restraining orders, moving if possible, blocking phone numbers, restricting contact, keeping as much distance from this person as possible to create a safe space between the abuser and the one that's being abused.
Because the alternative could mean losing everything.
Her whole life was snatched from right in front of her.
She had a bright future ahead of her. She had a lot to look forward to.
Sakira was a beautiful woman who was young and aspiring, and I believe that if she did have the opportunity to live, that she would be doing amazing things.
The night did not begin with fear. It began with music. Light spilled across the open field like liquid gold, catching dust in the air and turning it into something almost magical. The desert heat had softened into a warm evening breeze, just enough to carry the sound of laughter across thousands of voices gathered under the Nevada sky. Boots tapped against packed dirt. Plastic cups clinked together. Somewhere near the front of the stage, a group of strangers had already become friends, arms draped over each other's shoulders as they sang along to lyrics they all somehow knew by heart. This was what people came for. Not just the music, but the feeling. The illusion that, for a few hours, nothing else mattered. No responsibilities, no past, no future pressing in. Just the moment. Just the rhythm. Just the shared pulse of a crowd moving as one. At the center of it all stood the stage, bright, commanding, alive. The performers rotated in and out, each one greeted with cheers that rose like waves, crashing and retreating, only to build again. Phones lifted into the air, tiny glowing rectangles capturing fragments of joy that would later feel impossibly distant. No one was looking up. Not really. Because there was nothing up there worth seeing. Just the silhouette of Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino looming in the distance, its windows reflecting the city lights like a grid of quiet stars. It was part of the backdrop, no different from the skyline itself. Something permanent. Something harmless. Inside one of those windows, high above the ground, a man stood in the dark. Stephen Paddock did not move with urgency. There was no panic in the way he adjusted his position, no hesitation in the way his hands worked with quiet precision. Everything about him suggested control. Routine. The kind of focus that comes not from emotion, but from preparation. The room behind him was not chaotic. It was arranged. Objects placed where they needed to be. Equipment laid out with intention. Tools that had been brought in piece by piece, unnoticed, unremarked upon by anyone who passed him in the hallways days earlier. A man checking into a hotel with luggage. A man who did not draw attention. A man who, by all appearances, belonged exactly where he was. There was no visible anger on his face. No outward sign of what was about to happen. Just stillness. Below him, the music shifted into another song. The tempo changed, drawing the crowd into a different rhythm. Some people swayed. Others jumped. A couple near the center of the field spun in a loose circle, laughing as they nearly collided with strangers who didn't seem to mind. It was loud. So loud that small sounds disappeared into it. So loud that a single sharp crack, out of place, unnatural, could easily be mistaken for something else. The first sound did not register as danger. It slipped into the music, blending just enough to avoid immediate recognition. A few heads turned, confused but not alarmed. Someone frowned, glancing toward the stage as if expecting an explanation. Another person shrugged it off, already returning to the song. Then it happened again. This time closer together. Faster. A pattern began to form, but it was still incomplete, still just outside the edge of understanding. Because the human mind resists sudden shifts into fear. It looks for familiar explanations first. Fireworks. Equipment malfunction. Some kind of effect meant to enhance the show. Anything but what it actually was. Up in the darkened room, Stephen Paddock adjusted his stance slightly. The angle mattered. The distance mattered. The way the crowd moved mattered. Not individually, never individually, but as a whole. A mass. A shifting, living surface. His finger moved. And this time, the sound did not blend. It tore through the air in a rapid, relentless burst, too fast, too consistent to be anything accidental. The rhythm was wrong. Mechanical. Unforgiving. Below, confusion cracked open into something else. People stopped moving in sync. Some froze. Others turned, scanning the darkness around them, trying to locate a threat that had no visible source. The sound echoed in a way that made direction impossible to determine. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then someone fell. Not dramatically. Not with a scream. Just a sudden collapse, like a string had been cut. For a moment, the people closest didn't react. They didn't understand what they were seeing. Someone reached down, instinctively, thinking maybe it was heat exhaustion, maybe alcohol, maybe something that could be fixed with a little help. Then another person dropped. And another. That was when the realization began to spread, not all at once, not clearly, but in fragments. A look of confusion turning into fear. A shout that didn't quite form words. A movement backward that triggered others to do the same. The sound above them continued. Unbroken. Unstoppable. It no longer resembled anything familiar. It was too fast. Too deliberate. Too real. Panic does not arrive evenly. It starts in pockets. Small clusters of people reacting before others understand why. A ripple that grows, uneven, unpredictable, until it becomes something larger than the individuals within it. A wave. And once it begins, it cannot be controlled. People started to run. Not in a single direction, there was no direction to run toward. Only away. Away from the sound, from the falling bodies, from the growing sense that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Shoes slipped on dirt. Drink spilled. Phones dropped and forgotten. Someone screamed a name that disappeared into the noise. Others followed. The music stopped, but the sound that replaced it was louder in a different way. Chaotic. Human. Filled with fear that had no clear outlet. Above it all, from the 32nd floor, Stephen Paddock continued. There was no visible change in his pace. No hesitation. No shift in behavior that suggested awareness of what was happening below beyond the fact that it was exactly what he had intended. The distance between him and the crowd created a separation that was almost unreal. He could not hear individual voices. Could not see faces clearly. Only movement. Only the effect. And perhaps that was part of it. The removal of immediacy. The absence of direct human connection. Violence, from that height, became something abstract. Until it wasn't. Down below, people began to understand. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to know that they were not safe. Enough to know that the sound meant something final. Something that could not be ignored or explained away. Some tried to shield others. Bodies turning instinctively toward those they cared about. Hands pulling, pushing, guiding in directions that might or might not lead to safety. Others dropped to the ground, hoping invisibility could protect them. Hoping that stillness might make them less of a target. But there was no pattern to the danger. No logic that could be followed. Because the threat did not move through the crowd. It rained down on it. Relentless. Indiscriminate. Unseen. And in that moment, the illusion of control, the belief that danger can be anticipated, avoided, managed, collapsed completely. All that remained was instinct. Run. Hide. Survive. If possible. The night, which had begun with music and light, began to fracture. Not all at once. But piece by piece. A moment stretched into something unrecognizable. A celebration turning into confusion. Confusion into fear. Fear into something deeper. Something harder to name. Because once that line is crossed, once the realization sets in that this is not temporary, not contained, not something that will simply stop, everything changes. And for those still standing in that field, beneath those lights that no longer felt warm, beneath a sky that offered no answers, the question was no longer what is happening. It was, how do I get out of this alive? And somewhere above them, behind glass that reflected nothing of what it contained, a man continued to pull a trigger, again and again, as the night around him shattered into something that would never be whole again. The city of Las Vegas has always been built on illusion. Light where there should be darkness. Sound where there should be silence. A place designed to make people forget where they came from and lose track of where they're going. Time bends here. Nights stretch longer than they should. Mornings arrive too quickly, often unwelcome. But on October 1st, 2017, the illusion was different. It wasn't inside a casino. It wasn't behind velvet ropes or flashing slot machines. It was out in the open, beneath a wide desert sky, where thousands of people gathered for something simple, something honest. Music. The Route 91 Harvest Festival had become a tradition, a yearly escape for fans of country music who came from across the country. Some drove for hours. Others flew in, turning the weekend into a full experience, concerts at night, casinos by day, stories they would carry home long after the lights went out. By the final evening, the energy had shifted into something warmer, more settled. The first night excitement had softened into familiarity. Strangers recognized each other. Groups merged and separated. Laughter came easier. There was a rhythm to it. Boots pressing into the dirt in sync with the beat. The smell of spilled beer mixing with dry desert air. Voices rising together during the chorus of a song that, for a few minutes, belonged to everyone in the crowd. It felt safe. That's what made it so powerful. There were no barriers between people, no sense of threat lingering at the edges. Just open space, shared experience, and the quiet assumption that this was a place where nothing truly bad could happen. That assumption existed everywhere. In the way security checks were performed, present, but not invasive. In the way people moved freely, without hesitation. In the way no one looked at the towering structure of Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino as anything more than part of the scenery. It stood there, massive and still, its rows of windows catching the last traces of daylight before fading into reflections of neon and shadow. From the ground, it looked distant. Removed. Safe. No one in the crowd thought about what might be happening inside. Not the couple who had just gotten engaged near the back of the field, their friends surrounding them with cheers and phones raised to capture the moment. Not the group of co-workers who had spent the entire weekend together, bonding over music and late-night conversations that felt more honest than anything they shared back home. Not the father standing with his daughter near the side, her small frame lifted just enough so she could see over the heads of the crowd, her laughter cutting through the music in bursts of pure excitement. Each person carried their own story into that space. Some were celebrating. Others were escaping. A few were just passing through, drawn in by the promise of something enjoyable, something light. Together, they created a collective moment, one that felt temporary but complete, like it didn't need anything more. Above them, the sky stretched wide and empty, a deepening blue fading toward black. And above that, nothing. Or at least, that's how it seemed. Because perspective matters. From the ground, the hotel was just a building. From the 32nd floor, the world looked very different. Inside one of those rooms, Stephen Paddock existed in a space completely detached from the energy below. The curtains were drawn back just enough to create a narrow view. The lights inside were dim, carefully controlled. There was no music here. No laughter. No movement that wasn't deliberate. The room had been transformed. Not in a way that would be obvious at a glance, but in the subtle details. The arrangement of objects. The positioning of equipment. The quiet order that suggested planning, not spontaneity. This was not a place someone had stumbled into. It was a place someone had prepared. Over the days leading up to that night, Paddock had moved through the hotel unnoticed. A guest among thousands. A man carrying bags. A man using elevators. A man exchanging brief nods with staff who had no reason to remember him. Nothing about his behavior triggered alarm. Because nothing about him fit the expectation of danger. He was older. Reserved. Calm. The kind of person people pass without thinking twice. And that was the most dangerous part. Because people don't prepare for threats that don't look like threats. They don't question what feels normal. They don't look closer at what blends in. Inside the room, time moved differently. While the crowd below followed the rhythm of music, Paddock followed something else entirely. A sequence. A plan. Each action connected to the next in a way that removed the need for hesitation. There was no visible rush. No sign of second guessing. Just quiet progression toward a moment that had already been decided. Back down at the festival, the night continued. The stage light shifted colors, washing over the crowd in waves of red, blue, and gold. The headliner's voice carried across the field, strong and steady, anchoring the experience in something familiar. People sang along, some off-key, some loud enough to be heard over the music itself. It didn't matter. That was part of the charm. Perfection wasn't the point. Connection was. And for a while, that connection held. It filled the space between strangers. It softened the edges of everything outside that moment. Even the distant hum of the city seemed to fade, replaced by something more immediate, more human. No one was counting time. No one was thinking about what came next. Because the present felt enough. That's what made the shift so violent when it came. Because it didn't just interrupt the night. It shattered it. The contrast between what was and what followed would become the defining feature of everything that happened next. Joy turning into confusion. Confusion into fear. Fear into something far more permanent. But in those final moments before everything changed, none of that existed yet. There was only the music. The movement. The shared illusion that this night, like so many others in Las Vegas, would end the way it was supposed to. With tired feet. With fading voices. With memories that felt safe to revisit. No one in that field, looking up at the glowing windows of Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, could have imagined that one of those windows held something else entirely. Not light. Not life. But a silence so controlled, so deliberate, that when it finally broke, it would drown out everything else. They didn't arrive as a crowd. They arrived as individuals. Each with their own story, their own reason for being there, their own quiet expectations for how the night would unfold. The festival grounds of the Route 91 Harvest Festival didn't just hold thousands of people, it held thousands of lives, intersecting for a brief moment in time. If you had walked through the field that evening, before everything changed, you wouldn't have seen victims. You would have seen moments. A woman in her 20s adjusting the brim of her hat, laughing as her friend teased her for taking too many photos. She had saved for months for this trip, carefully setting aside small amounts of money until it became enough to justify the flight, the hotel, the tickets. This was her reward. A break from routine. A reminder that life could still feel exciting. A few steps away, a man stood with his brother, both of them older now, both carrying years that had pulled them in different directions. They didn't see each other often anymore. Work, family, responsibilities, things that slowly create distance. But here, in this space filled with music they grew up listening to, the distance felt smaller. They spoke in half sentences, shared looks that didn't need explanation. This was their way of reconnecting. Closer to the stage, a group of friends moved together like a single unit, arms raised, voices loud, their energy spilling outward into everyone around them. They had arrived early, claimed their spot, refused to give it up. This was where they wanted to be, close enough to feel the music in their chest, loud enough that it drowned out everything else. Not far from them, a couple stood slightly apart from the densest part of the crowd. He kept a steady hand on her back, guiding her gently whenever the movement around them became too much. She leaned into him without thinking, her head resting briefly against his shoulder between songs. They didn't need to speak. Their presence beside each other was enough. There were older faces too. People who had seen more years, more change, more reasons to stay home, and yet they were here. Drawn not just by the music, but by the feeling of being part of something alive. A shared experience that didn't ask for anything except presence. And scattered throughout the field were quieter stories. Someone standing alone, eyes closed, letting the music wash over them. Someone on the edge of the crowd, observing rather than participating, finding comfort in being near others without needing to engage. Someone texting a message to a loved one who couldn't be there, trying to capture the atmosphere in words that never quite did it justice. Each person carried something into that space. A memory they were trying to make. A feeling they were chasing. A moment they hoped would stay with them long after the night ended. None of them carried fear. Because fear requires a reason. And there was no reason here. The environment itself reinforced that sense of safety. Open air. Clear sightlines. A stage that drew focus forward, away from anything that might exist beyond it. Security present, but not overwhelming. Enough to suggest protection, not enough to create tension. Even the presence of Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in the background felt harmless. Just another part of the city's architecture, something permanent and unchanging. It didn't demand attention. It didn't invite suspicion. It simply existed. And that was enough. Because when something becomes part of the background, it disappears from conscious thought. No one looked at those windows and wondered what was behind them. No one imagined that distance could be used against them. No one considered that danger might come not from within the crowd, but from far above it. That kind of threat doesn't fit into everyday thinking. It doesn't belong in a place like this. And that's why it worked. Back in the crowd, the music shifted again. A slower song this time. The kind that changes the energy, pulls people closer together. Conversation softened. Movement slowed. Some couples turned toward each other, swaying gently, creating small pockets of intimacy within the larger mass of people. Phones came out again, screens glowing faintly as they recorded snippets of the moment. A woman near the center lifted her phone higher than the rest, trying to capture the stage, the lights, the feeling of being surrounded by thousands of voices moving in unison. She didn't notice the hotel in the background of her frame. It was just part of the composition, something static behind the living, breathing energy of the crowd. Somewhere else, a man checked the time briefly, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't ready for the night to end. Not yet. There was still more to experience, more to feel, more to hold on to before reality returned. And reality always returns. But no one expected it to arrive like this. Not suddenly. Not violently. Not in a way that would split the night into two distinct parts, before and after. Because up until that moment, everything made sense. The environment. The people. The purpose. Even the small imperfections, the spilled drinks, the crowded spaces, the occasional push from someone trying to move closer to the stage, felt normal. Manageable. Part of the experience. Nothing suggested that within minutes, those same spaces would become obstacles. That the same density that created energy would create chaos. That the same closeness that brought people together would make it harder to escape. The victims of that night were not defined by what happened to them. They were defined by who they were before it. By the lives they had built. The relationships they carried. The small, ordinary details that made them human. And that's what makes the shift so difficult to process. Because when violence enters a space like this, it doesn't just take lives. It interrupts stories. It cuts through moments that were never meant to end that way. It turns ordinary people into something else, something remembered for the way their story ended, rather than the way it was lived. And yet, if you look closely, if you step back from the scale of it all, those original stories are still there. In the laughter that filled the air before the first shot. In the connections that formed between strangers. In the quiet, personal moments that existed within the larger crowd. Those things don't disappear. They become part of the memory too. A contrast. A reminder of what was lost, not just in terms of lives, but in terms of possibility. Because every person in that field carried a future with them. Plans. Dreams. Things they hadn't done yet. Words they hadn't said. Moments they expected to have. And for some of them, that future would end without warning. Without explanation. Without a chance to understand why. That's the hardest part. Not just the violence itself. But the randomness of it. The way it reached into a space that felt safe and altered it permanently. The way it chose no specific target, no single story, but instead affected anyone who happened to be there. Anyone who had made the simple decision to attend a concert on a Sunday night. Anyone who believed, even briefly, that they were in a place where nothing truly bad could happen. Because that belief was the one thing they all shared. And it was the one thing that would be taken from them first. The moment did not arrive with clarity. It arrived in fragments. A sound that didn't belong. A pause in movement. A hesitation that spread unevenly through the crowd, as if reality itself needed a second to catch up with what was happening. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A sharp crack somewhere above the music. Then another. And another. Too quick to be fireworks, but too unfamiliar to be immediately understood. People turned their heads, searching for something visible, something that could explain it. Eyes moved toward the stage, toward the speakers, toward each other. Confusion passed silently between strangers. Someone laughed nervously. Another shrugged. The music continued. For a few seconds longer, the illusion held. Then the rhythm changed. The sound became faster. Relentless. No longer isolated, but continuous, like something tearing through the air with mechanical precision. That was when the first real break in perception happened. Not everyone understood at once. But enough people did. Enough for the energy to shift. A man near the center of the crowd stopped mid-step, his expression tightening as he listened. His body reacted before his mind fully caught up, shoulders pulling inward, eyes scanning upward toward the dark outline of Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. He didn't know what he was looking for. But something told him to look. Then someone fell. Just a few feet away. No dramatic movement, no warning, just a sudden collapse, like the ground had disappeared beneath them. For a split second, the people nearby didn't move. They stared, trying to process what they had just seen. One of them crouched down instinctively, reaching out. That was when the next burst came. Louder. Closer. Unmistakable. The sound didn't echo like fireworks. It cut. Sharp, direct, impossible to ignore. The man who had crouched froze, his hand hovering inches above the person on the ground. His eyes widened, not from what he saw, but from what he realized. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't part of the show. This was something else entirely. And once that realization took hold, it spread faster than the sound itself. Panic doesn't explode. It builds. Unevenly. A few people start moving first, stepping backward, then turning, then breaking into a run. Others follow, not because they understand, but because movement itself becomes a signal. Something is wrong. Run. The crowd, which had once moved in rhythm, began to fracture. Bodies shifted in different directions, colliding, separating, reforming in chaotic patterns. Some people tried to push forward, thinking the danger might be behind them. Others turned toward the edges, searching for exits they hadn't needed to think about before. There was no single path. No clear direction. Only instinct. Above them, from the 32nd floor, Stephen Paddock continued. Each movement was controlled. Measured. There was no hesitation in the way he adjusted his position, no pause between bursts that suggested uncertainty. The distance between him and the crowd created a strange detachment, a separation that allowed the act to continue without interruption. Below, that distance became a trap. Because no one could see him. No one could point and say, there. No one could orient themselves around a visible threat. The sound came from above, but the exact source remained hidden, blending into the structure of the hotel, into the darkness behind its windows. That uncertainty made everything worse. Because when you don't know where danger is coming from, every direction feels wrong. People dropped to the ground, pressing themselves into the dirt, hoping stillness would make them invisible. Others ran blindly, their focus narrowed to the single goal of getting away, even if they didn't know where away was. A woman grabbed her friend's arm, pulling her forward, their movements uncoordinated, driven by urgency rather than direction. They stumbled, nearly falling, catching themselves just enough to keep moving. Behind them, someone screamed. Not a word. Just sound. Raw, uncontrolled, filled with something deeper than fear, something closer to shock. Near the stage, a group that had been dancing minutes earlier now moved as a cluster, trying to stay together, hands gripping tightly as if letting go meant losing each other completely. One of them looked back, just for a second, and saw the ground behind them dotted with bodies that hadn't been there before. He turned forward again immediately. Because looking back didn't help. It only made it harder to move. The music had stopped. But the noise hadn't. Now it was something else. Footsteps pounding against the ground. Voices shouting over each other. The continuous, mechanical bursts that cut through everything else. And beneath it all, a growing awareness that this wasn't ending quickly. That this wasn't a momentary disruption. It was ongoing. Sustained. Each second stretched longer than the last, filled with uncertainty, with movement that had no clear purpose beyond survival. Near one of the barriers, a man tried to help someone to their feet, his movements frantic, unsteady. The person he was lifting didn't respond the way he expected. Their weight shifted awkwardly, their body not cooperating. He adjusted his grip, tried again. Another burst. He flinched, instinctively lowering himself, pulling the other person down with him. For a moment, they stayed like that, pressed against the ground, breathing hard, waiting for something they couldn't define. Waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Across the field, small moments like that repeated. People helping, pulling, shielding. Some using their own bodies as cover for others, acting without thinking, without calculating risk. Because in that kind of moment, instinct overrides everything else. Protect. Move. Survive. The open space that had once felt freeing now felt exposed. There were no walls to hide behind. No structures to block what was coming from above. Every step taken across that ground felt uncertain, as if safety might exist just a few feet further, even though no one could be sure. At the edges of the crowd, some people began to find their way out, spilling into areas beyond the main field, their movement still frantic, still disorganized, but carrying them away from the center of the chaos. Others followed. Slowly at first. Then faster. The mass began to thin, not because the danger had passed, but because the instinct to escape had finally found direction. But for those still inside, still caught in the middle of it, time didn't move forward. It stretched. Each second layered on top of the last, building into something that felt endless. And above it all, behind glass that reflected nothing of what was happening below, Stephen Paddock continued to fire, his actions disconnected from the human chaos unfolding beneath him. No words. No demands. No visible reaction. Just a sequence of movements that had been set in motion long before the first shot was fired. Down below, the night had been broken. Not just interrupted. Not just altered. But shattered into something that could never be put back together the way it had been before. Because once a moment like this begins, it doesn't simply end. It leaves something behind. In the ground. In the air. In the people who survive it. A line drawn between what the night was and what it had become. The first sirens did not cut through the chaos immediately. At first, they were distant, faint, almost indistinguishable from the noise already filling the air. But as seconds stretched into minutes, that sound began to grow, weaving its way into the confusion like something trying to impose order on a situation that had already slipped beyond control. By the time law enforcement began to understand what they were responding to, the scene below Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino had already transformed into something unrecognizable. The field that had held music and movement was now scattered with stillness and motion in unequal measure. Some people were still running, pushing toward exits, their paths erratic, their focus narrowed to escape. Others had stopped, not because they were safe, but because they didn't know where to go next. And then there were those who no longer moved at all, their presence marking the ground in a way that would later become impossible to ignore. When the first officers arrived, they didn't step into a clearly defined scene. They stepped into uncertainty. Reports were fragmented, overlapping, often contradictory. Shots fired. Multiple shooters. Explosions. The information came in pieces, each one incomplete, each one shaped by the perspective of someone who had just experienced something they couldn't fully process. That uncertainty slowed everything. Not because of hesitation, but because clarity takes time, and time was the one thing no one had. Some officers moved toward the crowd, drawn by instinct, by training that prioritized immediate response to visible harm. Others turned their attention outward, trying to locate the source of the gunfire, scanning rooftops, structures, anything that might provide a vantage point. The sound itself offered a clue. It came from above. But above was not precise enough. In a city like Las Vegas, above could mean anything: high-rise buildings, parking structures, countless elevated positions that overlooked the open space of the festival. Still, one structure stood out. The height. The angle. The proximity. Mandalay Bay. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere had not yet caught up with the reality unfolding outside. Guests moved through the lobby, some aware that something was happening, others still caught in the routine of a typical night, checking in, heading to elevators, conversations that hadn't yet been interrupted by urgency. That began to change quickly. Security received reports. Not clear, not complete, but enough to trigger concern. Shots fired. Possible location: upper floors. The information moved upward through the chain, each step adding a layer of tension, of uncertainty that demanded action without providing full understanding. Security officers began to move. Elevators were accessed. Floors were identified based on the angle of the gunfire reported from outside. There was no certainty, only direction. Up. As they ascended, the distance between them and the chaos outside narrowed in a way that felt almost unreal. Inside the elevator, the environment remained controlled, enclosed, disconnected from the violence below. But with each passing floor, that separation became thinner. On the 32nd floor, the hallway was quiet. Too quiet. The contrast was immediate. Outside, there was noise, movement, panic. Here, there was stillness. Carpeted floors absorbing sound. Closed doors lining both sides of the corridor. Soft lighting that cast no shadows sharp enough to suggest danger. But something was wrong. It wasn't visible in the way objects were arranged. It was in the absence of normalcy. The lack of movement. The sense that this space, which should have been occupied, had been emptied of its usual rhythm. One of the first indicators came not from sight, but from disruption. A hotel security guard had already encountered something unusual, something that didn't fit the expected pattern of guest behavior. A door. A blockage. An obstruction placed deliberately in a hallway that should have remained clear. That detail, small on its own, became significant in context. Because it suggested intention. Preparation. Whoever was responsible for the gunfire had not acted impulsively. They had created barriers. Controlled space. Anticipated movement. As officers moved further down the corridor, the sound of gunfire became clearer, not louder, but more defined. The echo carried differently inside the building, bouncing off walls, creating a distorted sense of distance that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact source. Still, it was close. Too close to ignore. They advanced carefully. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Measured. Each step taken with the understanding that the threat could appear at any moment, from any direction. And yet, when they reached the room, there was no immediate confrontation. The door was closed. Solid. Unyielding. Behind it, the sound continued. A steady, controlled sequence of gunfire that had not yet stopped. The officers positioned themselves, assessing. There was no visual confirmation of the suspect. No way to see inside. Only the knowledge that whatever was happening, it was happening there. The decision to breach would not be immediate. It required coordination. Back up. Time. And outside, time was measured differently. Every second carried weight. Every delay had consequence. Meanwhile, below, the scene continued to unfold. Emergency responders began to arrive in greater numbers, paramedics, additional officers, fire units, all converging on a space that had no clear boundaries, no defined perimeter. Victims were not contained to a single location. They were spread across the field, across surrounding areas, in places where people had run, where they had fallen, where they had been carried by others trying to help. Triage began where it could. Not in structured zones, but wherever there was space. Wherever someone could kneel beside another person and assess, act, try to stabilize. There were no quiet corners. Only fragments of attempts to restore order. Some people used clothing as makeshift bandages. Others applied pressure where they could, guided by instinct more than training. Phones became tools, not for recording, but for calling, for reaching out, for trying to connect with help that was already on its way but never seemed to arrive fast enough. Vehicles that had not been intended for emergency use became transport. Cars. Trucks. Anything that could move. Drivers didn't wait for instruction. They acted. Loading injured strangers into back seats, into passenger spaces, making decisions in seconds that would normally require coordination. Hospitals across the city began to fill. Not gradually, but in waves. Patients arriving faster than systems were designed to process. Staff shifting into emergency mode, expanding capacity, adjusting priorities. Inside those rooms, the outside world narrowed into individual cases. One person at a time. One injury at a time. Because even in large-scale tragedy, care happens on a personal level. And back at the hotel, on the 32nd floor, the officers remained outside the door. Waiting. Preparing. Listening. The gunfire, which had once been constant, began to slow. Not abruptly, but gradually. The bursts becoming less frequent. The intervals between them stretching longer. Until finally, silence. Not the kind of silence that brings relief, but the kind that raises new questions. Has it stopped? Is it over? Or is this something else? The absence of sound created its own tension. Because without it, there was no confirmation. Only uncertainty. And behind that door, whatever had been set in motion was no longer active. But it wasn't finished. Not yet. Because discovery comes after the event. After the action. After the moment when everything shifts from happening to having happened. And that shift, in cases like this, is where the full weight of reality begins to settle in. Not all at once, but piece by piece, detail by detail, as the scene reveals itself for what it truly is. The first instinct in any investigation is to find a shape, a pattern, something that can be followed, something that leads somewhere, something that makes the chaos feel like it belongs to a system that can be understood. But in the immediate aftermath of what happened beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, there was no shape. Only fragments. Fragments of information coming from different directions, each one carrying urgency, each one incomplete. Witness accounts overlapped and contradicted each other. Some swore there had been multiple shooters. Others pointed to different buildings. A few described sounds that didn't match what investigators would later confirm. And that made sense. Because trauma distorts perception. It compresses time, stretches moments, alters memory in ways that feel real but don't always align with reality. People had run without knowing where they were going. They had looked up without seeing anything. They had heard sounds echoing off structures, bouncing through open space, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. To them, it had felt like the threat was everywhere. So the investigation began not with certainty, but with expansion. Officers moved outward, securing not just the festival grounds, but the surrounding areas. Streets were blocked. Buildings were checked. Every possible angle that could have provided a line of sight into the crowd became a point of interest. Because until proven otherwise, there could have been more. More shooters. More locations. More danger waiting to reveal itself. That uncertainty dictated everything. Inside the hotel, on the 32nd floor, the tension had shifted into something quieter but no less intense. The officers outside the room where the gunfire had originated remained in position, their focus narrowed to a single objective. Containment. No one in. No one out. But containment doesn't answer questions. It only holds them in place. Behind the door, there was no movement now. No sound. The silence had settled in a way that felt unnatural, heavy, like the absence of something that had been violently present just moments before. When the decision was finally made to breach, it wasn't rushed. It couldn't be. Every possibility had to be considered. The suspect could still be armed. There could be traps. There could be variables that had not yet revealed themselves. Preparation came first. Then action. The door gave way. And what they found inside did not match the chaos outside. It was controlled. Deliberate. The room, occupied by Stephen Paddock, did not look like the aftermath of a struggle. There were no signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no indication that anything had gone wrong for the person who had occupied that space. Instead, there was order. Weapons arranged with intention. Equipment placed where it could be accessed quickly. The window, broken, providing a clear line of sight down to the festival grounds below. And near it, the body. Still. Unmoving. A single, final act that had ended not with confrontation, but with silence. For investigators, that created a different kind of problem. Because a suspect who is alive can be questioned. A suspect who is dead leaves behind only what they chose to leave behind. And in this case, that wasn't much. No note. No clear explanation. No immediate answer to the question that would soon dominate everything else. Why? The room offered clues, but not answers. The number of weapons suggested planning. The modification suggested intent. The positioning suggested awareness of the environment below. Everything pointed to preparation. But preparation for what purpose? That was not immediately clear. Outside, the scale of the event began to take shape. Numbers started to form where there had only been estimates. Casualties counted. Injuries documented. Each one adding weight to the realization that this was not just an incident. It was something larger. Something that would not be contained to a single report, a single timeline, a single explanation. And still, the possibility of additional suspects lingered. Because without a clear motive, without a clear narrative, the mind looks for complexity. It assumes there must be more. More people involved. More layers to uncover. Investigators began to trace Stephen Paddock backward. His movements. His history. The days leading up to the event. They looked at surveillance footage from the hotel, tracking his entries and exits, noting the times, the bags, the interactions, or lack of them. He had moved through the space quietly. Repeatedly. Bringing items in over time, not all at once. Avoiding attention not by hiding, but by appearing ordinary. That ordinariness became a focal point. Because it challenged expectation. There was no sudden change in behavior that had been flagged. No confrontation. No visible escalation. Just a series of actions that, when viewed individually, did not raise concern. But when assembled together, formed something else entirely. Something intentional. Investigators reached out to those who had known him. Neighbors. Acquaintances. People who had interacted with him in routine ways. The descriptions were consistent. Quiet. Reserved. Private. Nothing that aligned with the scale of what had just occurred. And that inconsistency created friction. Because the human mind seeks alignment. It wants actions to match personality. It wants cause to match effect. But here, that connection was missing. Or at least, not immediately visible. The investigation expanded further. Financial records. Travel history. Communication logs. Each piece examined for signs of motive, for connections that might explain the decision to carry out such an act. There were indications of planning. Purchases made over time. Movements that suggested preparation rather than impulse. But planning alone does not explain intent. It only confirms that intent existed. Some investigators considered the possibility of ideological motivation. Others looked for personal grievances. Still others explored the idea of psychological factors that might not leave clear traces in documentation. Each path led somewhere. But none led to a definitive answer. And in the absence of answers, speculation filled the space. Media narratives began to form, each one attempting to shape the story into something that could be understood, something that could be communicated clearly. But clarity requires certainty. And certainty was not yet available. Back at the scene, both at the festival grounds and inside the hotel, evidence was collected. Carefully. Methodically. Every detail documented, every item catalogued, every potential clue preserved. Because even when answers are not immediately visible, they can exist in small things. In patterns that only become clear over time. But time moves differently in the aftermath of something like this. For the public, it moves quickly. News cycles demand updates. Questions demand responses. There is pressure to explain, to define, to conclude. For investigators, it moves slower. Each step requires verification. Each conclusion must be supported. Because mistakes in understanding can lead to mistakes in action. And in a case like this, there is no room for that. Still, the central question remained. Not how. Not where. Those had been established. But why? Why this location? Why this method? Why this moment? And perhaps most unsettling of all. Why no explanation? Because sometimes, the most difficult cases are not the ones where the suspect escapes. They are the ones where the suspect is found. But the reason is not. In most investigations, there is a moment, a single point where everything begins to align. A detail that had seemed insignificant suddenly connects to something larger. A pattern emerges where there had only been fragments. The chaos starts to take shape, and for the first time, investigators feel like they are no longer chasing shadows. But in the aftermath of the shooting beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, that moment did not arrive in a single revelation. It came slowly. Reluctantly. And even then, it never fully resolved into something complete. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, was not about discovering something hidden. It was about confirming something unsettling. That there was no larger conspiracy waiting to be uncovered. No network operating in the background. No second shooter who had slipped away in the confusion. One by one, the possibilities that had expanded outward in the early hours began to close. Surveillance footage from inside the hotel became one of the first anchors. Investigators watched hours of recordings, tracing the movements of Stephen Paddock through hallways, elevators, and entry points. The footage showed him arriving, leaving, returning again, always alone. Always calm. There was no sign of accomplices. No indication that anyone had assisted him in transporting the equipment that would later be found in his room. The bags he carried were heavy, but not unusual enough to raise suspicion. In a city where guests come and go constantly, where luggage is a normal part of the landscape, his movements blended in. That was the first piece. Isolation. Then came the timeline. Records from the hotel, combined with surveillance data, began to outline the days leading up to the attack. Paddock had checked in, settled into his room, and over time, brought in the items he needed. Not all at once. Not in a way that would draw attention. But gradually. A suitcase here. Another there. Each trip adding to what would eventually become a fully prepared space. Investigators mapped it out carefully, aligning timestamps, identifying patterns. There was no rush in his behavior. No last-minute scramble. Everything suggested patience. Planning. Intent. Inside the room itself, the evidence reinforced that conclusion. The number of weapons. The way they had been arranged. The modifications that had been made. Nothing about it suggested spontaneity. This was not a reaction. It was a decision that had been built over time. And yet, even as those pieces fell into place, something remained missing. Because understanding how something was done does not explain why it was done. The next step was to look beyond the hotel. To move into Paddock's life outside of that room. Investigators reached into his past, searching for indicators, anything that might provide context for his actions. Financial records showed a man who had means. Not wealthy in the sense of excess, but stable enough to support his lifestyle. He gambled frequently, moving between casinos, spending long hours at tables and machines. There were fluctuations in his finances, wins and losses that came with that kind of behavior, but nothing that stood out as catastrophic. No sudden collapse. No obvious trigger. His personal relationships offered little clarity. He was not deeply connected to a wide circle of people. Those who knew him described him in similar terms. Private. Reserved. Not unfriendly, but not open either. The kind of person who exists on the edges of social interaction, participating just enough to function, but never fully engaging. That profile did not align with what people expected. Because people expect escalation. They expect warning signs. They expect something that, in hindsight, can be pointed to and understood as a precursor. But here, that clarity was absent. And that absence became the breakthrough. Not because it solved the case, but because it defined it. Investigators began to accept a difficult possibility. That there might not be a single, identifiable cause. That the answer to why might not exist in a form that could be documented, explained, or easily communicated. Instead, they shifted focus to what could be established. Behavioral patterns. Psychological indicators. Subtle details that, when combined, might offer insight, even if they didn't provide a definitive explanation. There were indications of isolation. Long periods spent alone. Limited social interaction. A lifestyle that revolved around routine rather than connection. There were also signs of control. The way he planned. The way he organized. The precision with which he executed each step. These elements suggested a personality that valued predictability, that sought to manage variables rather than leave things to chance. And then there was the act itself. The choice of location. The elevated position. The distance from the crowd. These were not random decisions. They were strategic. They allowed him to maintain control over the situation. To act without immediate interference. To remain detached from the direct consequences of his actions. That detachment became a focal point. Because it suggested something deeper than anger or impulse. It suggested a mindset that viewed the event not as a personal confrontation, but as something else entirely. Something removed. Abstract. But even with all of that, the core question remained unresolved. There was no manifesto. No statement of intent. No communication that outlined his reasoning. And in the absence of those things, the investigation reached a boundary. Not a failure. But a limit. A point beyond which evidence could not extend. For the public, that boundary was difficult to accept. Because people want answers. They want closure. They want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. They want to believe that if the cause is known, the event can be prevented, explained, contained. But not all events offer that. Some exist without clear origin, without a narrative that ties everything together. And that is what made this case different. The breakthrough was not a revelation. It was a realization that the story would not resolve in the way people expected. That the person responsible, Stephen Paddock, had left behind a complete picture of action, but an incomplete picture of intent. And that gap, that space where understanding should have been, would remain. Not because investigators had missed something, but because there was nothing there to find. And in that absence, the case settled into something more complex. Not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a reality that had to be accepted. That sometimes, the most important question, does not have an answer. Justice, in most cases, arrives with a face. A defendant seated behind a table. A courtroom filled with tension. Lawyers building narratives, piece by piece, until a story is formed, one that a jury can weigh, consider, and ultimately decide. There is a structure to it. A beginning, a middle, an end. A sense that, no matter how painful the details may be, the process itself will lead somewhere definitive. But in the aftermath of the shooting beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, that structure never fully materialized. Because the person who should have been at the center of that courtroom was already gone. Stephen Paddock had removed himself from the process before it could begin. There would be no trial. No testimony from him. No cross-examination that might expose inconsistencies, reveal motives, or provide even a fragment of explanation. And without that, the idea of justice became something else. Not absent, but altered. For the victims and their families, the absence of a trial created a space that could not be filled easily. Courtrooms, for all their limitations, offer something important, a place where stories are told in full, where details are laid out, where responsibility is formally assigned. They provide a kind of closure, not because they erase what happened, but because they define it within a system that people understand. Here, that definition had to come from somewhere else. Investigators presented their findings. Reports were compiled, released, examined. The sequence of events was reconstructed with as much accuracy as possible. Timelines were established. Evidence was documented. The actions of Paddock were laid out in a way that left little doubt about what had occurred. But explanation is not the same as accountability. And that distinction mattered. Because accountability, in the traditional sense, requires presence. It requires someone to answer, to respond, to face the consequences in a way that is visible, that can be witnessed. Without that, justice becomes less about confrontation and more about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of loss, of harm, of the reality that something irreversible has taken place. Legal processes still moved forward, but in different directions. Civil cases emerged. Families sought answers, but also responsibility from entities that might have played a role, however indirect. Questions were raised about hotel security, about response times, about whether anything could have been done differently to prevent or mitigate the outcome. These cases did not focus on the act itself, that had already been established. They focused on the environment around it. The systems. The safeguards. The possibility that within those systems, there were gaps. And if there were gaps, then perhaps there was a form of accountability to be found there. Not for causing the event, but for failing to stop it, or failing to recognize it in time. These legal battles were complex, not clear-cut, because assigning responsibility in a situation like this is never simple. The line between what could have been prevented and what could not is difficult to define. It requires examining decisions made before the event, under conditions that did not include the knowledge of what would happen. And that makes judgment harder, more uncertain. Still, the process mattered. because it provided a space for voices that might otherwise go unheard. For families to speak. To describe not just the loss, but the impact. The absence left behind. The way a single night had altered everything that came after. In those moments, justice took on a different form. Not a verdict. Not a sentence. But recognition. A public acknowledgement that what happened mattered. That the lives affected were not just numbers, not just statistics, but individual stories that deserved to be seen and heard. Outside the courtroom, the conversation continued. Policy discussions emerged. Debates about gun laws, about security measures, about how to address events that defy traditional understanding. These discussions were not unified. They moved in different directions, shaped by different perspectives, different beliefs about what justice should look like in a case like this. Some focused on prevention. On identifying ways to reduce the likelihood of similar events in the future. Others focused on response. On improving systems so that when something does happen, the impact can be minimized. And still others focused on the broader question. What does justice mean when the person responsible cannot be held accountable in the usual way? There was no single answer. Only a collection of responses, each one addressing a different aspect of the aftermath. For the survivors, justice was often personal. Not something defined by legal outcomes, but by their own process of understanding, of coping, of finding a way to move forward in a world that had changed suddenly and without warning. For some, that meant advocacy. Speaking out, sharing their experiences, pushing for changes they believed might make a difference. For others, it meant something quieter. Private healing. Rebuilding routines. Learning how to exist alongside memories that could not be erased. And for many, it meant living with questions that would never be answered. Because without a trial, without a direct confrontation with the person responsible, there is no moment where everything is laid out in a way that feels complete. No final statement that ties the story together. Only the understanding that some parts of it will remain unresolved. That justice, in this case, would not arrive in a single moment. It would exist in fragments. In the work of investigators. In the voices of those affected. In the changes, small or large, that followed in the wake of the event. And perhaps most importantly, in the recognition that even without a courtroom, even without a verdict spoken aloud, what happened that night beneath the lights of Las Vegas would not be forgotten. Because memory, in its own way, is a form of justice. Not one that punishes. But one that ensures that the truth remains. That the stories endure. That the impact is acknowledged again and again, long after the immediate aftermath has passed. And in a case where answers are incomplete, where motives remain unclear, that kind of justice, imperfect, evolving, carried forward by those who remember, may be the only kind that truly exists. There is a moment after everything ends when the world doesn't quite return to normal. Not immediately. Not cleanly. It lingers in between, caught somewhere between what was and what will be, unable to settle into either. For the city of Las Vegas, that moment stretched longer than anyone expected. The lights never went out. They couldn't. Las Vegas doesn't go dark. It doesn't pause. It doesn't allow silence to take over completely. Casinos stayed open. Traffic continued to move. Tourists still arrived, stepping into a city that, on the surface, looked unchanged. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Something subtle, but permanent. In the days that followed, the festival grounds where the Route 91 Harvest Festival had taken place became something else entirely. The stage was gone. The music had faded. What remained was space. Open. Quiet. And filled with absence. People began to gather there, not in celebration, but in remembrance. They came carrying candles, flowers, photographs. Items that, on their own, seemed small, but together formed something larger. A collective acknowledgement. That something had happened here. Something that could not be undone. The memorial grew slowly at first, then all at once. Notes written in hurried handwriting. Messages addressed to people who would never read them. Names repeated again and again, as if saying them often enough might keep them from disappearing. Strangers stood side by side, not speaking, not needing to. Their presence was enough. A silent agreement that this place, for now, belonged to something different. Grief. Not loud. Not chaotic. But steady. Enduring. For the survivors, the aftermath did not unfold in public spaces. It happened in quieter ways. In hospital rooms where the rhythm of machines replaced the rhythm of music. In homes where familiar objects suddenly felt out of place. In conversations that began normally and then stopped, interrupted by memories that arrived without warning. Trauma does not follow a schedule. It doesn't announce itself before it appears. It exists in moments. Unexpected. Uninvited. A sound that feels too sharp. A crowd that feels too close. A silence that feels too heavy. For some, it showed up at night. In dreams that replayed fragments of what had happened, never the whole event, never a clear sequence, but pieces. A sound. A movement. A feeling of running without knowing where to go. For others, it appeared during the day. In places that should have felt safe. Grocery stores. Parking lots. Any space where the mind, once aware of how quickly safety can disappear, struggled to fully relax again. This is the part of a story that is rarely seen. The part that doesn't fit into headlines or reports. The ongoing impact. The way a single event continues to exist long after it has ended. For the families of those who did not survive, the aftermath was defined by absence. Not dramatic. Not sudden. But constant. A chair that remained empty. A phone that would never ring again. A future that had been imagined but would never arrive. Grief, in these moments, is not always visible. It doesn't always look the way people expect. Sometimes it is quiet. Contained. Carried internally in ways that are difficult to express. Other times, it surfaces unexpectedly. In a memory. In a place. In a moment where something ordinary suddenly feels unbearable. And yet, even within that, there are attempts to move forward. Not because the past has been resolved, but because life continues, whether people are ready for it or not. Support groups formed. Spaces where survivors and families could speak openly, without needing to explain the context, without needing to justify their feelings. Because everyone in that space already understood. Not the exact details, but the weight. The complexity. The contradictions that come with trying to process something that does not fit into a simple narrative. In those conversations, certain themes emerged. Questions that had no clear answers. Why this night? Why this place? Why them? And perhaps the most difficult question of all. Why did I survive when others didn't? Survivor's guilt does not follow logic. It does not respond to reassurance. It exists in the gap between what happened and what could have happened. A space filled with possibilities that will never be resolved. For some, the only way to navigate that space is to find meaning. To take the experience and turn it into something that extends beyond the event itself. Advocacy. Awareness. Action. Not as a solution, but as a direction. A way to move forward without leaving the past behind. Back at Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, the physical signs of what had happened were gradually removed. The broken window was replaced. The room was cleared. The hallway returned to its usual state. On the surface, it became just another part of the building again. But places remember. Not in a literal sense, but in the way people perceive them. For those who knew what had happened, that space would never be neutral again. It would always carry something with it. A layer of meaning that could not be erased by repairs or time. The same was true for the city. Las Vegas continued. It had to. But it carried the event with it. In subtle ways. In increased awareness. In changes to security. In the way people looked at large gatherings, at open spaces, at the idea of safety itself. Because once something like this happens, the world does not return to the way it was before. It adjusts. It adapts. But it does not forget. And perhaps that is the most important part of the aftermath. Not just the grief. Not just the loss. But the memory. The collective understanding that something changed here. Something that cannot be undone. And in that understanding, there is a quiet responsibility. To remember not just the event, but the people within it. Not as victims alone, but as individuals who existed fully before that night. Who had lives, connections, futures that extended far beyond a single moment. Because if the story ends only with what happened, then something essential is lost. But if it continues, through memory, through acknowledgement, through the ways in which people carry it forward, then it becomes something more. Not just a tragedy, but a reminder of how fragile normalcy can be, and how deeply its loss can be felt. Time does not move the same way after something like this. It doesn't flow forward in a straight line. It circles back. It pauses. It lingers in places that feel unresolved, returning again and again to moments that refuse to settle into the past. For the survivors of the shooting beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, time became something unpredictable. Days passed. Weeks followed. Months stretched out. But inside those spans, there were moments where everything felt as immediate as it had been that night. A sound that echoed too sharply. A sudden movement in a crowded space. The distant pop of something harmless that, for a split second, felt like something else. The body reacts before the mind can intervene. Heart rate rising. Breath shortening. Muscles tightening as if preparing to move, even when there is nowhere to go. This is how trauma stays. Not as a constant presence, but as something that waits. And then returns without warning. For some, the memory came in fragments. Not a continuous replay, but flashes. A glimpse of the stage lights. The feeling of the ground beneath their hands. The sound, not as a clear sequence, but as a sensation, something felt more than heard. Others remembered more. Details that refused to fade. The direction they ran. The face of someone they lost in the crowd. The exact moment when confusion turned into understanding. That level of clarity can be its own burden. Because remembering means reliving. And reliving means the event never fully ends. It just changes form. Outside of those internal experiences, life continued to demand attention. Work. Family. Daily routines that did not pause, even when the people living through them felt disconnected from everything around them. Returning to normal life was not a single step. It was a process. Slow. Uneven. Sometimes invisible to others. Because from the outside, recovery can look complete long before it actually is. A person goes back to work. Attends social events. Smiles in conversations. And yet, internally, something remains unsettled. Something that does not align with the appearance of normalcy. That disconnect can create its own kind of isolation. Because explaining it is difficult. How do you describe a feeling that doesn't have clear boundaries? How do you communicate something that exists in moments rather than constants? Some found ways to speak about it. Through therapy. Through support groups. Through conversations with people who had been there, who didn't need explanations because they shared the same experience. Others carried it quietly. Not because they wanted to, but because putting it into words felt impossible. Or insufficient. Because language has limits. And some experiences exist beyond those limits. For the families of those who were lost, time carried a different weight. It moved forward, but it did not bring closure. Anniversaries became markers. Dates that arrived each year with a kind of inevitability, bringing with them memories that felt sharper, more defined. The first year. The second. Each one different. Each one carrying its own set of emotions. Grief does not follow a timeline. It changes. It shifts. But it does not disappear. It becomes part of life. Integrated in ways that are both visible and hidden. A photograph placed somewhere prominent. A habit that continues in honor of someone no longer there. A quiet moment in the middle of an ordinary day where the absence becomes suddenly, painfully clear. And yet, even within that, there are attempts to create something meaningful. Scholarships established in the names of those who were lost. Events organized to bring people together, not in mourning alone, but in recognition of lives that mattered. Acts of kindness inspired by memory. Not because they undo what happened, but because they extend something forward. They take the past and give it a direction. Back in Las Vegas, the impact of that night continued to ripple outward. Not always in visible ways, but in subtle shifts. Security measures were reviewed. Emergency response protocols examined, adjusted, refined. Not in reaction alone, but in preparation. An acknowledgement that what had happened once could happen again. And that readiness mattered. At large events, there was a difference now. Not immediately obvious, but present. A layer of awareness that hadn't been there before. People still gathered. Still celebrated. Still came together in spaces designed for joy. But somewhere in the background, there was a quiet understanding. That safety is not guaranteed. That it exists within conditions that can change. And that awareness, once gained, does not fully fade. For the broader public, the memory of the event settled into a different kind of space. Not as immediate. Not as personal. But still present. It became part of a larger conversation about violence, about unpredictability, about the ways in which ordinary moments can be disrupted without warning. And in that conversation, there were no easy conclusions. No single solution that addressed everything. Only a recognition of complexity. Of factors that intersect in ways that are difficult to control. And perhaps most unsettling of all. The realization that not every act has a clear motive. That sometimes, events occur without a narrative that makes sense. Without a reason that can be understood. That absence of explanation does not sit comfortably. It leaves a gap. A space where questions remain. And questions, when unanswered, have a way of persisting. But life does not wait for answers. It continues. People move forward. Not because everything has been resolved, but because moving forward is the only direction available. And in that movement, something changes. Not the past. That remains fixed. But the relationship to it. The way it is carried. The way it is understood. The way it influences what comes next. For some, that influence becomes a source of strength. A reminder of resilience. Of survival. For others, it remains a weight. Something that must be managed, navigated, lived with. There is no single outcome. No uniform way to process something like this. Only individual paths, shaped by experience, by support, by the ability, or inability, to find meaning in what happened. And through all of it, one truth remains. That night did not end when the gunfire stopped. It extended forward. Into days. Into years. Into lives that continue to unfold, carrying with them a moment that cannot be erased. Only remembered. Only understood in fragments. Only lived with, one day at a time. Memory does not preserve events the way they happened. It reshapes them. It softened some edges while sharpening others. It let certain details fade into the background while holding on to moments that refuse to disappear. And over time, what remains is not a perfect record, but something more personal, something filtered through emotion, through perspective, through the quiet, persistent need to make sense of what cannot be undone. For those connected to the night beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, memory became both a refuge and a burden. Because remembering means holding on to what was lost. But it also means returning, again and again, to a moment that changed everything. In the months and years that followed, the story of that night began to exist in different forms. Not just in official reports or news coverage, but in the way people told it to each other. In the way survivors described what they saw, what they felt, what they carried with them afterward. No two versions were exactly the same. Even when they described the same space, the same moment, the same sequence of events, the details shifted. One person remembered the way the lights looked just before everything changed. Another focused on the sound, the rhythm of it, the way it cut through everything else. Someone else remembered the feeling of a hand gripping theirs, pulling them forward, refusing to let go. These differences were not contradictions. They were reflections of how the mind processes trauma. It does not record everything equally. It selects. It prioritizes. It builds a narrative that is not necessarily complete, but is meaningful to the person who carries it. And in those narratives, certain themes began to emerge. Moments of fear, yes. Moments of confusion. But also moments of connection. Strangers helping strangers. People making decisions in seconds that revealed something fundamental about who they were. Acts of courage that did not come from training or preparation, but from instinct. From something deeper. Because in extreme situations, people do not always become something else. They become more of who they already are. Those stories mattered. Not because they changed what happened, but because they expanded it. They reminded people that even in the middle of something defined by violence, there were actions that reflected something different. Something human. Outside of personal memory, the event also began to take on a broader cultural presence. Documentaries were made. Articles written. Discussions held about what it meant, what it revealed, what it suggested about the world people were living in. Some focused on the scale. The number of people affected. The magnitude of the loss. Others focused on the unknowns. The absence of a clear motive. The unanswered questions that remained long after the investigation had reached its limits. And then there were those that focused on the individuals. The names. The faces. The lives that had existed before that night and deserved to be remembered beyond it. Because there is a risk, in events like this, of reducing everything to numbers. To statistics that, while accurate, fail to capture the full reality. 60 lives lost is a number. But each of those lives contained years of experience, relationships, memories, moments that cannot be quantified. And remembering that requires intention. It requires effort. It requires choosing to see beyond the scale and into the details. In Las Vegas, that effort took many forms. Memorials remained. Not always permanent, not always in the same place, but present. Spaces where people could go, where they could pause, where they could reflect. Anniversaries became moments of collective memory. Times when the city, and others beyond it, would stop, if only briefly, to acknowledge what had happened. To say the names. To hold space for the absence. These acts of remembrance were not about reopening wounds. They were about refusing to let them disappear. Because forgetting is not the same as healing. And healing does not require absence of memory. It requires integration. A way of carrying the past that allows the present to continue. For some, that integration came through storytelling. Through sharing experiences in a way that transformed them from something internal into something that could be understood, even if only partially, by others. For others, it came through action. Advocacy. efforts to create change, to address the factors that might contribute to similar events in the future. And for many, it came through quieter means. Personal rituals. Private moments of reflection. Ways of honoring what was lost without needing to explain it to anyone else. Meanwhile, the unanswered questions remained. Why had Stephen Paddock done what he did? What had led him to that point? What had existed in the space between his outwardly ordinary life and the actions he ultimately took? These questions did not fade with time. They became part of the story. Not as mysteries waiting to be solved, but as elements that defined its complexity. Because not every story offers resolution. Not every event provides a clear narrative that can be followed from cause to effect. Some exist in fragments. In pieces that do not fully connect. And learning to live with that can be one of the most difficult parts of the aftermath. There is a natural desire to close the loop. To find an answer that explains everything. That restores a sense of order. But when that answer does not exist, or cannot be found, something else must take its place. Acceptance. Not of what happened, but of the fact that it cannot be fully explained. That it exists as it is. Incomplete. And still real. In that space, memory becomes even more important. Because it is one of the few things that can hold the story together. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to ensure that what happened is not reduced to a single moment of violence. Enough to preserve the humanity within it. Enough to carry forward something that cannot be replaced. And so the story continues. Not in the way it began. Not with music or light or celebration. But in the quiet ways people remember. In the choices they make. In the ways they carry the past into the present. Because even when a moment ends, its impact does not. It moves forward. Through memory. Through meaning. Through the lives that continue, shaped by something they did not choose, but cannot ignore. And in that continuation, the story does not fade. It changes. It deepens. It becomes something that cannot be fully told, but must still be remembered. Understanding is something people reach for when confronted with something that feels impossible. It is a way of restoring balance, of creating a narrative that can be held, examined, and eventually placed somewhere within the boundaries of reason. Without it, events like the shooting beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino remain suspended, unresolved, difficult to process, resistant to closure. And so the question persists. Why? Not as a single inquiry, but as something layered. Why this man? Why this moment? Why this method? Investigators had already reached the limits of what evidence could provide. There was no manifesto, no declaration of intent, no clear articulation of motive left behind by Stephen Paddock. What remained were patterns, behaviors, fragments of a life that, when examined closely, suggested complexity without offering certainty. Psychological analysis became one of the few remaining avenues. Not to excuse. Not to justify. But to explore the internal landscape that might exist behind actions that defy ordinary explanation. Paddock lived a life defined, in many ways, by control. Not in a dramatic or outwardly visible sense, but in the structure of his routines, the precision of his decisions, the way he navigated the world around him. He spent long hours gambling, a space where risk and calculation exist side by side. There is a certain mindset required for that environment, a tolerance for uncertainty, but also a desire to manage it, to impose order on chance. That dynamic is not unusual on its own. But in the context of what followed, it becomes part of a larger picture. There were indications of isolation. Not total withdrawal from society, but a distance. A lack of deep connection. Relationships that existed, but did not anchor him in the way people often expect. Isolation, over time, can reshape perception. It can narrow focus. It can create an internal world that is not easily influenced by external perspectives. And within that space, thoughts can develop without interruption, without challenge, without the balancing effect of interaction. There were also signs of emotional detachment. Again, not in a way that would have been immediately alarming to those around him, but in the absence of visible extremes. No obvious expressions of anger. No dramatic shifts that would have signaled something building beneath the surface. That absence can be misleading. Because not all internal processes manifest outwardly. Some remain contained. Invisible. Until they are not. The act itself suggests something beyond impulse. It required planning. Preparation. Time. These are not the markers of a sudden loss of control. They are the markers of sustained intent. And sustained intent raises difficult questions. What sustains it? What allows an individual to move from thought to action without interruption? Without reversal? Some theories point to the possibility of a desire for control taken to an extreme. Not control over personal circumstances alone, but control over impact. Over outcome. The selection of a high vantage point, the distance from the crowd, the methodical execution, these elements suggest a scenario in which the individual could act without immediate resistance, without direct confrontation. That distance matters. Because proximity changes perception. When actions are carried out up close, the human element is harder to ignore. Distance creates separation. It allows the act to remain abstract, at least to the person carrying it out. Another possibility lies in the concept of cumulative factors. Not a single cause, but a convergence. Personal history. Psychological tendencies. Environmental influences. Each one insufficient on its own, but together creating a condition in which something like this becomes possible. The difficulty with this approach is that it resists simplicity. It does not offer a clear answer. It does not point to a single moment where everything changed. Instead, it suggests a gradual process. One that may not have been visible even to the person experiencing it. And then there is the possibility that no single framework fully explains it. That human behavior, in its most extreme forms, does not always conform to patterns that can be easily identified. That there are limits to what can be understood. Limits to what can be predicted. This is perhaps the most unsettling conclusion. Because it challenges the idea that with enough information, enough analysis, everything can be explained. It suggests that some actions exist outside that expectation. Not completely beyond comprehension, but beyond complete explanation. For the public, this creates tension. Because uncertainty is difficult to accept. It leaves space for speculation, for competing narratives, for attempts to fill the gap with something that feels more complete. But completeness is not always available. And forcing it can lead to distortions. To conclusions that feel satisfying, but are not supported by evidence. So the question remains. Not unanswered in the sense that nothing is known, but unresolved in the sense that no single answer encompasses everything. Why did Stephen Paddock do what he did? There are pieces. Elements that can be examined, discussed, considered. But they do not form a single, coherent explanation. They form a mosaic. Incomplete. Complex. And perhaps that is where understanding must settle. Not in certainty, but in recognition. Recognition that human behavior can reach extremes that challenge the frameworks used to interpret it. Recognition that not every action can be traced back to a clear, identifiable cause. Recognition that the absence of a definitive answer does not diminish the reality of what happened. If anything, it makes it more difficult. More enduring. Because without a clear reason, the event resists closure. It remains open. A question that continues to exist alongside the facts. And in that space, people are left to navigate their own understanding. To find meaning where they can. To accept what cannot be fully explained. And to carry forward a truth that is, in its own way, incomplete. That sometimes, the most profound impact of an event is not just what it reveals, but what it leaves unresolved. In the years that followed, the story did not end. It changed shape. What had once been a single night, compressed into headlines, defined by urgency and shock, began to stretch outward, touching places and people far beyond the boundaries of Las Vegas. The event became something that lived on, not just in memory, but in culture, in policy, in the quiet ways individuals carried it with them into their everyday lives. Because stories like this do not disappear. They settle. They become part of a larger narrative about safety, about unpredictability, about the fragile line between ordinary life and sudden disruption. At first, the focus remained close to the event itself. The victims. The survivors. The unanswered questions. But over time, the lens widened. People began to ask not just what had happened, but what it meant. What it revealed about the world they lived in. What it suggested about the systems designed to protect them. In that broader conversation, the shooting beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino became a reference point. Not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern, one that raised difficult questions about how and why such events occur, and what, if anything, can be done to prevent them. These questions did not lead to simple answers. They led to discussions. Debates that unfolded in public spaces, in legislative chambers, in communities trying to reconcile the need for security with the desire for freedom. Some focused on access. On the mechanisms that allowed one individual to carry out such an act. Others focused on response. On how quickly help arrived, how effectively systems functioned under pressure, what could be improved in the future. And still others focused on the human element. On the psychological factors that might contribute to such behavior, even when those factors do not form a clear, predictable pattern. These conversations did not always align. They moved in different directions, shaped by different priorities, different perspectives. But they shared something in common. A recognition that what had happened could not simply be filed away and forgotten. That it demanded attention. Not just in the immediate aftermath, but in the years that followed. For some survivors, this broader impact became part of their personal journey. They stepped into roles they had never expected to occupy. Advocates. Speakers. Voices in a conversation that extended far beyond their own experience. They told their stories not because it was easy, but because it felt necessary. Because in sharing what they had lived through, they could contribute to something larger than themselves. A collective effort to understand, to improve, to prevent. But not everyone chose that path. And that, too, mattered. Because survival does not come with obligation. Not everyone wants to relive their experience in public, to attach their identity to a single moment in time. For many, healing remained private. A process that unfolded quietly, away from attention, shaped by personal needs rather than public expectation. Both responses were valid. Both were part of the broader aftermath. Because the impact of that night was not uniform. It did not produce a single type of response, a single way of moving forward. It created a range of experiences, each one shaped by individual circumstances, by the support available, by the way each person processed what had happened. Beyond the individuals directly affected, the cultural memory of the event began to take form. It appeared in documentaries, in articles, in conversations that revisited the night, not to sensationalize it, but to examine it, to understand its place within a larger context. These representations carried responsibility. Because how a story is told influences how it is remembered. Focus too much on the violence, and the human element is lost. Focus too little, and the reality of what happened becomes diluted. The balance is difficult. And not always achieved. But when it is, the story becomes something more than a record of events. It becomes a reflection. A way of exploring not just what happened, but what it means. In that reflection, certain themes persist. The unpredictability of violence. The limits of understanding. The resilience of individuals and communities in the face of something that cannot be undone. These themes are not unique to this event. But here, they are concentrated, intensified, given form through a specific moment in time that continues to resonate. Even for those who were not there, who experienced the event only through media, the impact exists. It shapes perception. It influences the way people think about safety, about public spaces, about the idea that certain environments are inherently secure. Because once that assumption is broken, it does not fully return. It adjusts. It becomes more cautious, more aware. And that awareness becomes part of everyday life in ways that are often subtle, but significant. A glance toward exits when entering a crowded space. A moment of hesitation before fully relaxing in an unfamiliar environment. Small changes in behavior that reflect a deeper shift in perception. This is how events like this extend beyond their immediate context. They alter not just those who were present, but those who come after. Those who hear the story, who absorb it, who integrate it into their understanding of the world. And yet, despite all of this, despite the discussions, the changes, the awareness, the core of the story remains what it always was. A moment. A night. A series of actions carried out by Stephen Paddock that resulted in irreversible loss. Everything that follows builds outward from that point. But it does not replace it. It does not resolve it. It exists alongside it. As response. As consequence. As continuation. And in that continuation, the story remains active. Not frozen in time, but evolving. Shaped by the ways in which people choose to remember it, to learn from it, to carry it forward. Because even as years pass, even as new events emerge and take focus, this one does not disappear. It remains. Not always at the forefront, but present. Part of a larger understanding of what is possible. Of what has happened. Of what could happen again. And that awareness, however uncomfortable, becomes part of the legacy. Not just of the event itself, but of the world that exists after it. There is a point, in stories like this, where the details begin to fade into something quieter. Not because they are forgotten, but because they have been carried for so long that they no longer arrive with the same sharpness. They settle into the background of daily life, present but not always visible, like a shadow that only becomes noticeable when the light shifts in a certain way. Years after the night beneath Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, the world had, in many ways, moved forward. New headlines replaced old ones. New events demanded attention. The constant motion of time created distance between what had happened and the present moment. But distance does not erase impact. It changes how that impact is felt. For some, the memory softened. Not in meaning, but in intensity. The immediate shock, the rawness of those early days, gave way to something more stable, more integrated into the rhythm of life. They could think about that night without being pulled entirely back into it. They could speak about it without their voices breaking, without their thoughts fragmenting. That kind of shift is not forgetting. It is adaptation. A way of carrying something heavy without letting it consume everything else. For others, the distance did not bring the same relief. Time, instead of softening the memory, created space for it to echo. Without the constant attention of the world, without the shared focus that had existed in the immediate aftermath, the experience became more internal. More personal. And sometimes, more difficult. Because when the outside world moves on, it can feel like the internal experience is left behind. Unresolved. Unseen. This divergence, this difference in how people move forward, is one of the most complex aspects of trauma. There is no single path. No universal timeline. Only individual journeys, each one shaped by factors that are often invisible to others. Support systems. Personal resilience. Circumstances that either allow for healing or complicate it. And within those journeys, meaning becomes something that is not found all at once. It is built. Piece by piece. Moment by moment. For some, meaning comes through connection. through relationships that deepen in the aftermath of shared experience. Bonds formed in crisis that continue beyond it, providing a sense of understanding that does not require explanation. For others, it comes through purpose. Through actions that extend beyond the self, helping others, advocating for change, contributing to something that feels larger than the event itself. And for many, meaning remains uncertain. Not absent, but evolving. Something that shifts over time, that takes different forms at different stages, that does not settle into a single, clear definition. This uncertainty is not a failure. It is part of the process. Because not all experiences resolve into something that can be easily understood. Some remain complex, layered, resistant to simplification. In Las Vegas, the physical traces of that night became less visible over time. The spaces that had once been marked by immediate aftermath were restored, repurposed, reintegrated into the everyday life of the city. Visitors who arrived years later might pass through those areas without knowing what had happened there. They would see buildings, streets, open spaces, but not the history embedded within them. And yet, that history remained. Not in a way that could be seen directly, but in the collective memory of those who knew, who remembered, who carried the story forward. Memorials, both formal and informal, continued to exist. Some permanent, others temporary, all serving the same purpose: to create a space where memory could be held, where names could be remembered, where the event could be acknowledged even as the world around it continued to change. These spaces were not just about the past. They were about continuity. About ensuring that what happened was not reduced to a moment that existed only in history, disconnected from the present. Because when something like this is remembered, it influences what comes next. It shapes decisions. It informs awareness. It becomes part of the framework through which people understand risk, safety, and the unpredictability of the world around them. At the same time, there is a balance that must be maintained. Between remembering and being defined by what is remembered. Between honoring the past and allowing space for the present to exist without being overshadowed. This balance is not easy. It requires intention. It requires an ongoing effort to hold both things at once. To acknowledge what happened without letting it consume everything that follows. For the broader public, this balance often leans toward distance. The event becomes part of a larger collection of memories, one among many, its details less immediate, its presence less dominant. But for those directly connected to it, that balance is more delicate. More personal. Because the past is not something separate. It is something that continues to exist within the present. In thoughts. In reactions. In the quiet moments where memory surfaces without warning. And yet, even within that, life continues. Not as it was before. Not unchanged. But moving. Evolving. Carrying forward both the weight of what happened and the possibility of what still can be. This coexistence of past and present, of memory and movement, is perhaps the most enduring legacy of that night. Not just the event itself, but the way it continues to live on. In different forms. In different people. In different ways. Because while the moment has passed, its influence remains. Not always visible. Not always at the forefront. But present. Shaping, in subtle and sometimes profound ways, the lives of those who carry it. And in that presence, there is something that cannot be erased. Not by time. Not by distance. Not by the natural progression of the world moving forward. A quiet, persistent reminder that even as life continues, some moments stay.